A groan. Low. Metal, but wrong. Metal that shouldn't be making a sound like that. Then a pop. Sharp. Like a rifle shot. If a rifle shot could echo underwater. Then another, and another. Faster now. A drum roll of steel rivets tearing loose, one after another. Hot metal shrieking against itself. For 1 second, maybe 2, the street outside doesn't understand what it's hearing. Then the wall comes down. Not water, not fire. Something slower and somehow worse. A wall of brown, glistening syrup 40 feet high, moving toward you faster than you can turn and run. This is Boston, January 15th, 1919. And in the next 3 minutes, a neighborhood is going to drown. Not in water, but in molasses. 21 people will die. 150 will be hurt. Horses will be swallowed where they stood. A steel railway will be torn apart like paper. And somehow, almost nobody remembers it happened. Before the wave, there was a Wednesday. An ordinary one. Picture the North End at lunchtime in January of 1919. Narrow streets stacked 3 and 4 stories high with tenement housing. Laundry strung between buildings even in the cold. The air thick with wood smoke and the brine of the nearby harbor. This was an immigrant neighborhood, largely Italian-American, packed tight with families who had crossed an ocean for the promise of something better and found, instead cramped rooms and long hours. It was warm that day, unseasonably warm, close to 40 degrees after a hard freeze the week before. Kids had shed their coats. Men on their lunch breaks sat outside on crates and stoops, glad for the sun on their faces. And looming over all of it, over the firehouse, over the elevated railway, over the row houses where families were eating their midday meal, stood a tank. 50 feet tall, 90 feet across, built in 1915 by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company and filled right now on this particular Wednesday with over 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Why molasses? Because molasses ferments into alcohol, and alcohol becomes munitions. The war in Europe had demanded it by the tanker load. And now that the war was over, the company had a new deadline bearing down on it: prohibition, arriving in less than a year. Every gallon in that tank was profit racing against the clock. There wasn't time to slow down. There wasn't time to double check. There wasn't time, it turned out, to build the tank correctly at all. The steel plates were too thin, in places barely half the thickness they should have been. The metal itself was the wrong grade, brittle in cold weather, prone to cracking under stress it was never tested against. And the tank leaked. It had leaked almost since the day it was filled. A slow weeping of syrup down its outer wall, dark trails that stained the ground below. The company's solution wasn't to fix it. It was to paint the tank brown so the leak would blend in. Neighborhood children used to come by with sticks, catching the drips, licking off a rare sweet treat in a neighborhood where sweets were hard to come by. None of them knew they were tasting a warning. If you had pressed your palm against that tank in the weeks before January 15th, you might have felt it. A faint tremor, almost like breathing. Workers nearby said the tank groaned, not occasionally, regularly. A deep, resonant creak that some described as sounding almost human. Some of them joked about it the way people joke about the things that frighten them. Others didn't joke. One local firefighter stationed close enough to hear it every day would later say the sound unsettled him, that something about it felt less like metal and more like a living thing in pain. The company had been warned. There had been complaints, filed and half investigated, about the tank's soundness. Nothing came of them. Filling continued. Only 5 days before the disaster, a fresh shipment of warm molasses had been pumped in from a ship docked nearby, layering hot syrup on top of the older, colder liquid already inside. Different densities, different temperatures, pressing against the hull already stretched past what it could safely hold. And now, it was Wednesday, and the temperature outside had jumped more than 30 degrees in a single day, warming the metal, thinning the molasses, waking something inside that tank that had been groaning quietly for months. At 12:30 in the afternoon, workers nearby heard the groan turn into something else, a grinding, a vibration you could feel through your boots. 10 minutes later, it stopped groaning. It screamed. 12:40 p.m. Lunch hour. Commercial Street is full. Workers, children, horse-drawn wagons, a fire station just across the way, an elevated train rattling along its trestle overhead. The rivets go first. A sound like gunfire, one after another, faster than anyone can count. Then the seams. Then the wall of the tank itself, tearing open along its base in a single catastrophic instant. 2.3 million gallons don't fall. They erupt. A wave of molasses, brown, glistening, warm from the day's sudden heat, bursts outward at nearly 35 miles an hour. Faster than a person can run. Faster than a horse can bolt. 40 feet high at its crest, according to witnesses who lived to describe it. A wall taller than the buildings around it, rolling down Commercial Street like something out of a nightmare no one had ever had before, because nothing like this had ever happened before. If you had been standing on that street, here is what you would have felt first. Not fear, but confusion. A roar, low and enormous, and then a rising wall of brown, and your mind refusing for half a second to process what it was looking at. Then it would have been on you. The molasses moved with a strange, terrible physics. Thick enough to crush, fast enough to drown. It didn't just knock people down. It buried them standing up. It filled doorways. It climbed stairs. It found the gaps between buildings and poured through them like water finds a drain. Except this water didn't drain. It held. A young boy playing near the tank never had a chance to run. A laborer on his lunch break mid-bite was swept from where he sat. Firefighters at the nearby engine house, men whose entire job was to run toward danger, were caught inside their own station as the wave hit its walls and the building buckled around them. The smell arrived with it, warm, cloying. The scent of burnt sugar and caramel turned suddenly, horribly wrong, thick enough to coat the back of your throat before you'd even understood you were in danger. And underneath the smell, the sound changing, the roar of the wave giving way to something quieter and somehow more disturbing. A wet, sucking silence, broken only by cries for help, muffled by syrup already hardening in the cold air at its edges while staying warm and thick at its center. People who survived described trying to run and finding their legs simply would not move, held fast the way a fly is held by amber, except this amber was still spreading, still finding new streets to fill. In under a minute, the neighborhood these families had built their entire lives inside of no longer existed in the shape they knew it. The wave didn't stop at people. It didn't stop at buildings either. The elevated railway, steel beams engineered to carry the weight of loaded passenger trains, buckled and collapsed as the molasses slammed into its support trestle. A train car packed with passengers came within moments of derailing off the broken track, saved only by a quick-thinking motorman who saw the street disappear beneath a brown tide and stopped in time. Nearby, the firehouse itself was struck with such force that a heavy engine, solid iron, built to survive fires, floods, collisions, was shoved bodily through the station's outer wall as if the building had simply stopped being solid. Homes came apart. Some collapsed outright, timber frames no match for the pressure of a wave that outweighed water and moved nearly as fast. Others were knocked from their very foundations, sliding sideways on the flood the way a boat slides on a wave, except boats are built to float and houses are not. And there were the horses, dozens of them, still harnessed to delivery wagons, still standing where their drivers had left them for the lunch hour. The molasses held them the way it held everything, not with speed, but with weight, with thickness, with a grip that only tightened the more they struggled against it. Rescuers would spend the following days trying to free the horses that could still be saved. Most could not be. This is what made the disaster so uniquely cruel: its speed. 35 miles an hour meant there was no outrunning it. Not for a man, not for a horse, not for anyone caught more than a few dozen feet from safety when the tank let go. A flood of water might have given people seconds to climb, to scramble, to find higher ground. This flood gave almost no one that chance. It arrived, and then it simply stayed. And staying was its own kind of horror. Because a flood of water eventually recedes, but 2 million gallons of cold, thickening syrup does not simply flow away. It waits. By the time the wave finally slowed, pooling 3, 4, in places nearly 15 feet deep across entire blocks, the north end had gone quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. The survivors who could move, moved slowly. Every step a fight against syrup thickening in the January cold, clothes soaked through and growing heavier with every yard. Some had to be cut free of debris. Others had to be cut free of the molasses itself, syrup congealing around limbs like something trying to hold on to them, even after the wave had stopped moving. Help came fast, and it came from everywhere. Boston firemen, Red Cross workers, and sailors from the nearby Navy Yard, wading in waist deep, using whatever they could find to break through the hardening syrup and reach the people still trapped beneath it. It was brutal, filthy, exhausting work. Rescuers described the molasses clinging to everything: tools, clothes, hands, faces, turning simple movements into a fight against a substance that seemed determined not to let go of anyone it had touched. One man, buried beneath rubble and syrup for hours, was found still alive, pulled free by rescuers who had nearly given up hope of finding anyone left breathing. Others weren't so fortunate. Some victims weren't recovered for days. The molasses, hardening in the cold, had to be broken apart in pieces, and searchers combing the wreckage sometimes found what they were looking for, only by following a hand, a boot, a scrap of familiar clothing breaking the surface of the brown. And for some who did make it out alive, the danger wasn't over. Molasses carries bacteria, and wounds packed with syrup and debris turned septic in the days that followed. Several of the 21 who died didn't die on January 15th at all. They died a week later, 2 weeks later in hospital beds, of infections no one back then fully understood how to fight. Grief in the North End didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in waves of its own. First, the ones pulled from the wreckage that first terrible afternoon, and then cruelly, the ones who seemed to have survived, only to be lost days later to a wound that wouldn't heal. The neighborhood didn't just clean up a disaster, it buried it slowly over weeks. A mourning that had no single day to mark, because the dying itself had no single day to end. In the disaster's first confused hours, many assumed the worst kind of villain, a bomb. 1919 was a jittery year, thick with fear of anarchist violence, and for a moment it seemed easier to believe that the tank had been attacked than to believe it had simply failed. But it hadn't been attacked. It had been built badly, filled recklessly, and ignored when it groaned its warnings. And slowly, that truth came out. More than 100 people, families of the dead and the injured, joined together in a lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, one of the largest class action-style civil suits in Massachusetts history up to that point. For nearly 6 years, the case dragged through hearings, engineering testimony, and appeals, as company lawyers tried to blame anarchist sabotage, and independent investigators dismantled that theory piece by piece, tracing the failure back to the steel itself. Plates too thin, rivets too few, a design that had never been properly tested for the stresses it was expected to bear. In the end, the company lost. It paid out roughly $1 million in settlements, an enormous sum for the era, and something more lasting than money came out of the case as well. The lawsuit became a landmark in American law, cited for decades afterward, establishing a clear legal principle. Companies are responsible for the engineering integrity of what they build, and ignorance is not a defense. Boston, and eventually cities across the country, tightened their building codes in response. Structural calculations had to be checked. Engineers had to sign off formally on their work. Steel had to meet real, verified standards rather than a company's convenient assumptions. In a very real sense, every building inspection you've never thought twice about, the ones that make modern cities safe enough to stop noticing, owes something to 21 people who died in a flood of syrup on a Wednesday in January. And the molasses itself? Most of it, something like 87%, was eventually recovered from the streets, the harbor, the wreckage. Cleaned, processed, and in a detail that still unsettles people who learn it for the first time. Much of it went on to be used exactly as originally intended. The city moved on because cities have to, but the North End didn't forget so easily, not right away. For years afterward, on hot summer days, when the sun warmed the pavement and the air went still, people in the North End swore they could still smell it. Sweet, faint, wrong somehow, in a way that made old-timers go quiet and cross the street without quite saying why. It's not there anymore, not really. Just a story people told, and then told less, and then mostly stopped telling at all. The tenements came down. The waterfront changed. New families moved in who had never heard of a flood that wasn't made of water. Today, if you walk along the harbor in Boston's North End, you'll find Langone Park, kids on a ball field, joggers along the water, the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood that healed the way neighborhoods do by simply continuing. And if you know where to look near the edge of the park, there's a small, easy-to-miss plaque, a few lines of text, 21 names if you count carefully. No monument towers over it, no tour buses stop. You could walk past it and never know that on this ground, on an ordinary Wednesday in 1919, greed built a tank too thin to hold what it promised. And a neighborhood paid for that shortcut with 21 lives. That's the quiet cruelty of this story. Not that it was forgotten by accident, but that it was, in its own way, allowed to be forgotten. The way so many stories of working-class neighborhoods and immigrant families are allowed to fade, while the buildings that replace them stand up straighter, thanks in part to the very disaster no one remembers. The smell is gone now, but the plaque is still there. So is the code book that inspectors carry into every new construction site, carrying inside it, whether anyone realizes it or not, the memory of a wave that moved faster than anyone could run. These are the stories history almost swallowed, subscribe so they're not forgotten. And if you're from Boston, did you know this happened before today?